What you are about to hear is the kind of story that stops you mid-breath. The kind that makes you grip your phone tighter and forget you were supposed to be doing something else. Because this is not just a story about a wedding. It's a story about a man who thought he could own a woman forever, and the one night he realized he had just challenged a monster. Imagine the most beautiful night of your life. 300 guests, crystal chandeliers, and a dress that made you feel like you finally mattered. Then, imagine your past walking up to you, looking you in the eye, and deliberately pouring dark red wine down your white lace bodice. He did it to break her. He did it because he thought he was the most powerful man in the room. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have prepared for in 1,000 years, was who was watching from the shadows with a neck tattoo and a silent army behind him. By the end of this, John Derek won't just lose his pride, he will lose everything. Stay right here, because the revenge is worth every second. This channel, we bring new emotional mafia stories dropping regularly. Hit subscribe and join the Cold Boss family. And tell me where you are watching from. Before John Derek became my nightmare, he was my everything. That's how people like him operate. They don't start with the wine or the insults. They start with a velvet glove. For the first year, I thought I was the luckiest woman in the city. John was the golden boy of the corporate world, a CEO who moved with a space-filling certainty that made everyone else seem like background noise. When he chose me, a quiet assistant with more dreams than connections, I felt like I had been plucked from the shadows and placed under a spotlight. But spotlights can burn. The CEO's shadow wasn't a place of protection. It was a place where I slowly began to evaporate. It started with the small edits. We would be getting ready for a gala, and he would look at my reflection in the mirror, his face a mask of disappointment. "That blue is a bit loud for someone of your standing, don't you think, Lee? It's almost desperate. Wear the black, it's more obedient." I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just his refined taste. But soon, the edits moved from my wardrobe to my soul. If I spoke up during a dinner with his board members, I would feel his hand tighten on my arm under the table, a warning squeeze that left a faint bruise and a loud message. Your job is to look beautiful, not to be heard. By the second year, I had stopped calling my sister. John said she was peasant-minded and dragged down my new image. I stopped mentioning my love for painting because John found the smell of turpentine offensive to his high-end olfactory senses. I became a master of the disappearing act while I was still standing right in front of him. I learned to make my voice softer, my opinions smaller, and my presence so light that I wouldn't disturb the air he breathed. I was living in a $10 million penthouse that felt like a sensory deprivation tank. Every day, I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was becoming as transparent as the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was a trophy, polished daily but kept behind glass, only brought out when John needed to show the world that he could own the best of everything. The breaking point didn't come with a blow, it came with a realization. I was sitting at my vanity, putting on a pair of diamond earrings he had bought me to apologize for calling me useless the night before. I looked at my eyes and realized I didn't recognize the person staring back. I was 25 years old, and I was already dead. I was just a ghost haunting John Derek's hallways. That was the night I planned my true disappearing act. I knew I couldn't just walk out the front door. John's reach was long, and his ego was even longer. To him, me leaving wasn't a heartbreak. It was a theft of his property. So I played the part of the perfect doll for 3 more months. I smiled at his jokes. I wore the black dresses. I dimmed my light until he was convinced I had no spark left to ignite a rebellion. I began moving in the early hours of the morning, cent by cent, dollar by dollar. I sold the designer bags he bought me and replaced them with high-quality fakes, funneling the cash into an account he couldn't see. I spent my lunch hours at the library, not at the high-end bistros he preferred, mapping out a life where I didn't have to ask for permission to exist. The night I finally left, the air in the penthouse was thick with the scent of lilies, John's favorite, because they reminded him of funerals, of things that stayed still. He was away on a business trip in London, blissfully unaware that his trophy was packing a single duffel bag with the few things that actually belonged to her. I left the diamonds on the marble countertop. I left the black dresses in the cedar closet. As I closed the door for the last time, I felt a weight lift off my chest that I hadn't even realized was crushing my lungs. I stepped into the elevator as John Derek's shadow, but when the doors opened at the lobby, I walked out as Lee Paul. I was heading into the cold, uncertain night with nothing but a few $1,000s and a flickering sense of self, but for the first time in 4 years, I could breathe. I didn't know then that my path would lead me to a man like Han Joon-Seok, a man who lived in a much darker world, but who would never ask me to be small. 6 months after I walked out of the penthouse, I was living in a small, third-floor walk-up that smelled of radiator fluid and old books. It was paradise. I had found work as a freelance linguistic consultant, specializing in high-level diplomatic and corporate Korean. My life was quiet, anonymous, and entirely mine, until the morning a black sedan idling at the curb changed everything. A man named Mr. Cho had contacted me for a sensitive translation job. He didn't give a company name, only a location, a private club tucked behind an unmarked steel door in the city's garment district. When I walked in, the air felt different. It wasn't the frantic, ego-driven energy of John Derek's boardroom. It was heavy, still, and impossibly cold. The men standing in the foyer wore black suits that looked like armor. They didn't look at me with the predatory gaze I was used to from the corporate world. They looked through me, their hands clasped in front of them with disciplined precision. One of them had a sliver of a tattoo peeking from beneath his collar, the tail of a dragon. I felt a momentary spike of the old fear, the urge to turn and run, but then the double doors at the end of the hall opened. That was when I first saw Han Joon-Seok. He was seated at the head of a long mahogany table, illuminated by the soft glow of a single green-shaded lamp. He didn't stand up when I entered, but the shift in the room was palpable. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the space, leaving only his presence. He was wearing a black shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, and a tailored suit that whispered of old, untouchable wealth. His hair was slicked back, revealing a strong jawline and eyes that seemed to record every heartbeat in the room. "Ms. Paul," he said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone. It wasn't loud, but it had a weight to it that made the walls seem to lean in. "Thank you for coming." The job was a negotiation between Joon-Seok's interests and a group of shipping magnates from Busan. For 3 hours, I sat to his left, translating complex legal nuances and subtle threats. The Busan men were loud. They shouted, they slammed their fists on the table, and they postured with the kind of desperate aggression I had seen in John Derek 1,000 times. But Joon-Seok never moved. He sat with his arms crossed over his chest, his expression an unreadable mask of calm. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. When the Busan lead shouted a particularly foul insult in Korean, Joon-Seok simply leaned forward. The room went dead silent. He didn't raise his voice. In fact, he spoke even softer than before. "The ocean does not bargain with the shore," I translated for him, my own voice trembling slightly at the sheer authority in his words. "It simply decides where the land ends." One of the bodyguards behind him shifted, and I caught a full glimpse of the dragon tattoo winding up Joon-Seok's neck, disappearing into his hairline. My heart hammered against my ribs. I realized then that I wasn't in a boardroom. I was in a sanctuary of a much darker sort. Yet, strangely, I didn't feel small. Unlike Derek, who used his voice to drown me out, Joon-Seok seemed to use his silence to create space. Throughout the meeting, he would glance at me, not to check if I was behaving, but to ensure I was following the pace. He looked at me as if I were a necessary part of the machine, not a decoration. When the meeting concluded, and the magnates had retreated, looking as though they had just survived a storm, Joon-Seok remained at the table. He poured a small glass of tea and pushed it toward me. "You have a gift for nuance, Lee," he said. He used my first name without the condescension I had come to expect from powerful men. "You hear what is not being said." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the controlled power in his squared shoulders and the silent vigilance of the men behind him. He was a man who could likely end a life with a nod, yet he had treated me with more professional courtesy in 3 hours than Derek had in 4 years. "I've spent a long time learning how to read the silence," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. He nodded slowly, his intense eyes searching mine. Then you know that in this room, silence is the only thing that is true. I think you and I will work well together. As I left the club that night, I realized the CEO's shadow was gone. I was stepping into a different kind of darkness, yes. But for the first time, the man in the center of it wasn't trying to make me disappear. He was watching the world, and he was inviting me to watch it with him. Trust is a fragile thing when you've spent years being told that your value is tied to your obedience. Working for Joon-Seok felt like walking on a frozen lake. The surface was beautiful and clear, but I was constantly waiting for the ice to crack. I expected the transition from translator to property to happen at any moment. I expected the demands, the jealousy, and the walls to start closing in, just as they had with John. But the crack didn't come from Joon-Seok. It came from the ghost I thought I had left behind. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 months into my work with the dragon, when I walked out of a grocery store and saw a familiar silver Bentley idling near my apartment. My breath hitched, my lungs suddenly feeling like they were filled with lead. The window rolled down just an inch, and I caught the scent of the expensive, sharp cologne John always wore, the scent of my own personal history of failure. I didn't wait to see his face. I ducked my head and ran, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs until I was locked safely inside my flat. The next morning, when I arrived at the Garment District Club, I was trembling. I tried to hide it, burying my hands in the folds of my skirt as I sat down to review the day's manifests, but Joon-Seok noticed. He noticed everything. He didn't ask me what was wrong in front of the others. He waited until the room cleared, then he set his pen down and looked at me with that unnerving, steady gaze. "You are vibrating, Lee," he said softly. "The air around you is tight. Tell me why." I hesitated, the old instinct to minimize my problems screaming at me to lie. But the honesty in his eyes acted like a magnetic pull. I told him about the Bentley. I told him about John Derek, not just the name, but the way he had eroded me, the way he viewed me as a stray he had taken in and could therefore dispose of. I expected Joon-Seok to be annoyed by the drama or to see me as a liability. Instead, he stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city he seemed to hold in the palm of his hand. "A man who uses his wealth to make a woman small is not a man," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "He is a child playing with things he does not understand. You are not his property, Lee, and you never will be again." He didn't ask for my permission to intervene. He didn't tell me I was being too sensitive, the phrase John used to use like a blunt instrument. He simply turned to Mr. Cho, who was standing by the door. "Assign Ray and the second detail to Ms. Paul," Joon-Seok commanded. 24 hours. They are to be the wall between her and the world. If that Bentley appears again, I want the driver brought to me. I surged to my feet, the panic rising. "Joon-Seok, no, I don't want to be followed. I spent 4 years being watched. I can't live in another cage." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just inches from me. He didn't reach for me, but the warmth radiating from him was a physical presence. "Lee, look at me." I raised my eyes to his. "A cage is meant to keep you in. My men are meant to keep the world out. They will not report your movements to me. They will not tell me who you speak to or where you go. Their only job is to ensure that when you look over your shoulder, you see a shield, not a shadow." For the first time in my life, a man was offering me protection without demanding a piece of my soul in return. Over the next few weeks, I learned what it meant to be guarded by a dragon. Ray and his team were ghosts. They didn't stand over my shoulder while I drank coffee. They sat 3 tables away, eyes on the door. They didn't tell me what to wear or who to see. They simply cleared the path before I walked it. When John sent a bouquet of lilies to my office with a note that read, "You're running out of places to hide," I didn't even see the flowers. Ray intercepted them, and by that evening, the lilies had been returned to John's office, shredded and soaked in gasoline. Joon-Seok never bragged about it. He never held his protection over my head like a debt. He just kept working, kept listening to my translations, and kept treating me like a person whose mind was the most valuable thing in the room. I realized then that I wasn't just his employee anymore. I was under his wing. And as I looked at the dark ink of the tattoo on his neck, I knew that anyone who tried to reach for me would have to go through the fire first. The transition from being protected to being loved by a man like Joon-Seok didn't happen in a burst of light. It happened in the quiet accumulation of moments where he chose my dignity over his own convenience. By the 6-month mark, the city felt different. I no longer walked with my head down, counting the cracks in the sidewalk. I walked with the knowledge that 4 silent, lethal men were weaving a tapestry of safety around me. But it was Joon-Seok himself who remained the greatest mystery. A man who lived in the heart of a storm, yet remained perfectly still. One Friday night, after a particularly grueling session involving a conflict with a rival syndicate, Joon-Seok didn't send me home in the usual sedan. Instead, he led me to the roof of the Garment District Club. The city of souls stretched out below us, a glittering carpet of neon and ambition, but up here, the air was thin and biting. Joon-Seok stood by the edge of the parapet, the wind whipping his black coat around his frame. He looked like a king surveying a kingdom he was tired of conquering. When I joined him, he didn't look at me immediately. He stayed focused on the horizon. "My world is not a place where people grow old peacefully, Lee," he said, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. "The power I hold is a double-edged blade. To stand beside me is to be a target for every man who wants to see me fall. It is a life of armored cars, checked perimeters, and the constant smell of ozone before a strike." I looked at his profile, the strong jaw, the steady eyes, the dragon tattoo that seemed to pulse in the moonlight. I waited for the but. I waited for him to tell me I would have to stay inside, that I would have to stop working, that I would have to become a ghost for my own safety. Instead, he turned to face me. He reached out, his hand hovering near my face before he settled it gently on the stone ledge beside me, never once crowding my space. John Derek wanted a doll he could display in a glass case. He wanted to be the sun so that you would be forced to be the moon, reflecting only his light. I do not want that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. He stood his ground, meeting me as an equal. Inside was a ring, a deep, blood-red ruby set in black gold, as fierce and unconventional as the man holding it. "I am a man who deals in blood and secrets," Joon-Seok said, his gaze intense enough to burn. "I cannot promise you a life of normalcy, but I can promise you this: I will never ask you to be small. I will never silence your voice to make mine sound louder. If you wear this, you are not just my wife. You are the queen of everything I have built. My men will bow to you not because I command it, but because you are the heart of this empire." I thought of Derek, who had given me diamonds as apologies for his cruelty. I thought of the way Derek had made me feel like a charity case he was intermittently proud of. And then I looked at Joon-Seok, a man who the world feared, but who was currently waiting for my answer with a vulnerability he likely showed no one else. He wasn't offering me a cage, he was offering me a throne. He was offering a life where the dangers were external, but the sanctuary within our walls would be absolute. In his world, I wouldn't have to hide. I would be the most protected woman in the country, not because I was weak, but because I was precious. "The CEO wanted a trophy," I said, my voice catching the wind. "But the dragon wants a partner." I reached out and took the box from his hand. I've spent my whole life being told what I was worth by men who didn't know how to value themselves. I'm done with that. If the world is going to come for us, let them come. I'd rather be a target beside you than a ghost in a penthouse. He didn't crush me in an embrace. He simply took my hand, his thumb tracing the line of my knuckles with a reverence that made me feel more powerful than any CEO's bank account ever could. As he slid the ruby onto my finger, I knew I had made the most dangerous, beautiful choice of my life. I wasn't just Lee Paul anymore. I was the dragon's queen. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a masterclass in organized silence. Joon-Seok's world was one of high walls and sharp eyes, and for a time, I truly believed those walls were impenetrable. The venue was a fortress of glass and gold, the grand imperial ballroom, a place where the air smelled of lilies and the hum of hidden security. Joon-Seok had spared no expense, not to show off, but to create a sanctuary. For him, this wasn't just a ceremony. It was a public declaration that the dragon had a heart, and that heart was now under the protection of his entire syndicate. I sat in the bridal suite, the lace of my sleeves itching slightly against my skin. I looked at the reflection in the mirror, the soft bridal updo, the delicate jewelry, the fitted bodice. I looked like the woman John Derek always wanted me to be, but the eyes staring back were different. They were steady. They were the eyes of a woman who knew that outside this door, men with dragon tattoos were standing guard over her peace. But John Derek was a man who believed that rules were things he bought and sold. He didn't see Joon-Seok as a threat. He saw him as a thug with a bank account, a common criminal who had stolen his property. John's ego had become a fever, burning through his common sense. He spent the morning of our wedding not in a boardroom, but in the back of a darkened sedan, using every ounce of his corporate leverage. He didn't need to fight his way in. He simply called the hotel's parent company, whispered about a multi-million-dollar contract renewal, and secured a consultant badge for himself and his 2 personal henchmen. The reception was a blur of music and forced smiles until the moment the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom creaked open. I was standing near the center of the room, my hand tucked into the crook of Joon-Seok's arm, laughing at a joke made by Mr. Cho. I felt Joon-Seok's muscles turn to stone before I even saw the source of the disturbance. The music didn't stop, but the energy in the room shifted, curdling like milk in the sun. John Derek walked in as if he owned the floorboards beneath his feet. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was in a dark gray luxury suit, his hair groomed to a lethal edge. He moved with a relaxed, terrifying confidence, ignoring the glares of the bodyguards who were already closing in. "Lee," he called out. His voice wasn't loud, but it had that old, sharp quality that used to make me flinch. He walked straight toward us, bypassing the shocked guests who stepped back as if he were carrying a plague. "I must say the decor is a bit gaudy, but I suppose that's what happens when you let the help plan the party." I felt the old reflex, the urge to apologize, to smooth things over, to make myself small so he wouldn't strike. My hand trembled on Joon-Seok's arm, but then I felt Joon-Seok's hand cover mine. He didn't squeeze it, he just held it steady, his warmth acting as an anchor. John stopped 5 feet away, his eyes moving over my dress with a sneer of pure possession. "You look beautiful, Lee, almost like the version of you I created. It's a shame you've decided to waste it on someone who belongs in a prison cell rather than a ballroom." He looked at Joon-Seok then, a look of cold, billionaire arrogance. He didn't see the danger. He didn't see the way Joon-Seok's bodyguards had formed a silent, disciplined semicircle behind him. He didn't see the neck tattoo or the way Joon-Seok's eyes had gone completely flat. John truly believed that his status as a CEO protected him from the consequences of the real world. "You're in the wrong room, John," I said, my voice surprising me with its clarity. John laughed, a dry, hollow sound. He reached out to a passing waiter and snatched a glass of red wine from a tray. He held it up, the liquid swirling like blood in the light of the chandeliers. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Lee. I'm here to remind you that you can change your name, you can change your house, and you can marry a monster, but you will always be mine to ruin." He took a step forward, the wine glass tilted precariously in his hand, and I realized with a jolt of horror that he wasn't here to talk. He was here to mark his territory. The air in the grand imperial ballroom became a vacuum. John Derek stood there, his tailored gray suit a sharp contrast to the black-clad wall of men now flanking my husband. He looked at the ruby on my finger, then back at my face, and his lip curled with a familiar, toxic proprietary. To John, I wasn't a bride. I was a piece of collateral that had defaulted on a loan. "You really thought you could just walk away, Lee?" he whispered, his voice cutting through the fatting music like a serrated blade. "You thought you could trade a king for a common criminal and keep your dignity." I felt Joon-Seok's grip on my hand tighten, not in a warning, but as a grounding wire. He was a silent storm, his eyes fixed on John with a lethality that would have sent any sane man running for the exits. But John was drunk on his own perceived invincibility. He believed that his name on the side of a skyscraper made him a god in a room full of mortals. "John, leave. Now," I said, my voice trembling despite the fire in my chest. "You're making a mistake you can't afford." He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the gold-leafed ceiling. "A mistake? No, Lee, I'm just giving this farce the ending it deserves." In one fluid, deliberate motion, John raised the wine glass. He didn't throw the liquid. He tilted it, holding it upside down directly over my head. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat as the dark, heavy Cabernet began to pour. It felt like slow motion, a ribbon of deep, blood-red liquid cascading through the air, hitting the pristine white lace of my fitted bodice. The warmth of the wine soaked through the expensive fabric, spreading across my chest in a jagged, ugly stain. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth in a reflex of pure, unadulterated shock. The contrast was violent. The pure, untouched white of the gown I had chosen with such hope, now marred by a spreading blemish the color of a bruise. The ballroom erupted in a collective, horrified gasp. I could hear the whispers of the elite starting like a wildfire, the rustle of silk as guests stepped back, the muffled clicking of phones, the soft, "oh my God," from a woman to my left. In that second, I wasn't the queen of a new empire. I was the girl in the peasant clothes again. I was the victim John had always told me I was. I felt the hot sting of tears pricking my eyes, the familiar weight of public humiliation threatening to crush my lungs. John looked at the empty glass, then at the ruined front of my dress, his face twisted into a mask of triumphant arrogance. "There," he sneered, leaning in close enough for me to smell the whiskey on his breath. "Now you look exactly how you feel on the inside. Stained, secondhand, nobody." He turned his gaze to Joon-Seok, expecting to see the frantic anger of a man who had been outmaneuvered. He expected a scene, a brawl, something he could use to prove he was the more civilized man. But Joon-Seok didn't move. He didn't shout. He stood perfectly upright, his arms now crossed firmly over his chest, his shoulders squared like a soldier's. He watched the wine drip from the hem of my gown onto the marble floor with a terrifying, clinical focus. His expression was a desert of emotion, save for the intense, predatory light in his eyes. Behind him, Ray and the bodyguards shifted into a tight formation, their faces like stone, their hands moving toward their jackets. The silence that followed the splash was heavier than the sound of the wine hitting the floor. It was the silence of a predator that had just seen its mate wounded. "Is that all, John?" Joon-Seok asked. His voice was so quiet it was barely a murmur, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the room, silencing the gossip in a heartbeat. John blinked, his smirk faltering for the first time as he realized that the man in front of him wasn't reacting like a CEO. He was reacting like a man who had already decided where John's body would be found. I've said what I came to say," John stammered, his arm finally dropping to his side. Joon-Seok reached out, his fingers grazing the wet lace of my sleeve with a tenderness that broke my heart. Then he looked at John, and for the first time he let the mask slip. The dragon didn't just wake up, he was already breathing fire. "You didn't just ruin a dress, John," Joon-Seok whispered. "You just signed the deed to your own funeral. Now watch very carefully, because this is the last time you will ever be the most important person in a room." The silence in the ballroom was no longer awkward. It was surgical. John Derek stood with his empty wine glass, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of dominance, waiting for the outburst that would prove his superiority. He wanted a brawl. He wanted to be the victim of mafia brutality so he could sue his way back into relevance. Joon-Seok didn't give him the satisfaction. My husband didn't even raise a hand to wipe the wine from my lace sleeves. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a slim, black, encrypted phone. He didn't look at the screen. His eyes remained locked on John, as if he were memorizing the exact shade of the man's cowardice. He pressed a single speed dial button. "Begin," Joon-Seok said. The word was a pebble dropped into a deep, dark well. He ended the call before a second could pass. For a moment, John sneered. "A phone call, that's your move. I have the best legal team in the hemisphere, Joon-Seok. You can't touch me." "I don't need to touch you, John," Joon-Seok replied, his voice a low, terrifying hum. "I've already dismantled you. You're just the last one to know." John's phone buzzed in his pocket. Then it buzzed again, and again, a frantic, rhythmic stutter that shook his dark gray suit. He pulled it out with a smirk that slowly curdled into a mask of pure white horror. I watched his eyes dart across the screen. The first notification was from his primary offshore holding in the Caymans, account flagged, assets frozen. The second was from the domestic branch of his firm, unauthorized access detected, trading suspended. What is this? John stammered, his fingers fumbling over the glass. Joon-Seok stepped closer, his shadow falling over John like a shroud. You spent 4 years making Lee feel small because you thought your money made you big. But in my world, your money is just digital ink, and I own the pen. Across the room, the large monitors that had been displaying our wedding photos flickered and changed. They didn't show the dragon's logo, they showed the live feed of a boardroom. I recognized the faces, the board of directors for Derek's firm, Alderton Capital. They were in an emergency session, their faces twisted in panic. One of them was shouting into a speakerphone, his voice echoing through the ballroom's high-fidelity speakers. John, where the hell are you? The SEC just locked our servers. We have a whistleblower from the inside, someone named Lisa. She's handed over 3 years of offshore ledgers. The board is voting to strip your CEO title effectively immediately. John's knees buckled. The wine glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor next to the red pool that had ruined my dress. He looked up at Joon-Seok, and for the first time, he saw the predator for what it was. He saw the neck tattoo, the silent, disciplined bodyguards, and the sheer, unmoving weight of a man who didn't play by the rules because he wrote them. You can't do this, John whispered, his voice cracking. I'm John Derek, I'm a billionaire. You were a billionaire an hour ago, Joon-Seok corrected him softly. Now, you're just a man who spilled wine on my wife's dress, and that is a debt you can't afford to pay. Joon-Seok turned to me then. He reached out and gently took my chin in his hand, tilting my face up so I had to look into his eyes. The coldness was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective heat. Do not look at the stain, Lee, he whispered. Look at me. The trash is being collected. Your life starts now. I looked at John, the man who had been the ceiling of my world for so long, and I realized he was nothing. He was a small, broken man standing in a puddle of his own making. The fear that had lived in my chest for years didn't just fade, it evaporated. Ray and Mr. Cho stepped forward then, moving with the synchronized grace of a hunting pack. They didn't grab John, they simply stood on either side of him, a wall of black silk and muscle. The federal marshals are waiting in the lobby, Mr. Derek, Mr. Cho said with a polite, chilling bow. It would be best if you didn't keep them waiting. They find arrogance very tedious. As John was led away, not with a bang, but with a whimpering silence, Joon-Seok pulled me into his arms. I pressed my wine-stained chest against his black suit, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely, untouchably clean. The grand imperial ballroom was still reeling, the air thick with the metallic scent of spilled wine and the electricity of a fallen empire. As John Derek was led away, his shoulders slumped, his tailored suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume, the guests remained frozen. They were witnessing the death of a titan and the birth of a legend. But while Joon-Seok had provided the power to crush Derek's walls, I was the only one who held the key to the vault. Joon-Seok led me toward a private alcove behind the velvet-draped stage, away from the prying eyes of the elite. He didn't look at my ruined dress with pity. He looked at me as if I were a soldier returning from a victorious front. The board has stripped him and the banks have frozen him, Joon-Seok said, his voice dropping to that intimate, gravelly register. But Derek is a snake, Lee. He has spent a lifetime building backdoors. If we don't seal them now, he'll find a way to slide through the cracks of the legal system. He needs a killing blow. I reached into the hidden pocket sewn into the layers of my silk crinoline, a detail I had insisted on during the final fitting. My fingers brushed against a small, cold piece of plastic, a USB drive. It felt heavier than it actually was, carrying the weight of 4 years of whispered threats, late-night business, calls I wasn't supposed to hear, and the digital ghost of a woman who had been too afraid to speak. I didn't just leave him 6 months ago, Joon-Seok, I whispered, pulling the drive out. The light from the crystal chandeliers caught the silver casing. I took a piece of him with me. During those final, terrifying months in the penthouse, when I was playing the part of the perfect doll, I had become a ghost in his machine. John used to think I was so invisible, so insignificant, that he would leave his encrypted laptop open while he shouted orders to his shell company managers. He thought I was reading fashion magazines when I was actually recording his voice on my burner phone. I had captured it all: the price fixing, the offshore money laundering, and the night he laughed about paying off the inspectors after the factory fire in Indonesia. Joon-Seok took the drive from my hand, his thumb grazing my palm. For a moment, his calm mask wavered, replaced by a look of profound respect. He signaled to Mr. Cho, who appeared instantly with a secure laptop. "This is the Queen's evidence," Joon-Seok murmured, handing the drive over. "Ensure it reaches the federal prosecutors within the minute. I want the indictment updated before Derek even reaches the precinct." As Mr. Cho worked, the audio began to play through a localized speaker, a low, distorted version of John's voice, arrogant and cruel. "She's a nobody just like the rest of them. If the books don't balance, we just bury the debt in the Caymans. Who's going to stop me? Lee, she doesn't even know how to balance a checkbook." Hearing those words now didn't make me flinch. It didn't make me feel small. It felt like watching a movie of a stranger's life. I looked down at the red wine stain on my chest, the jagged mark that John thought would be my badge of shame. In the blue light of the laptop screen, the stain didn't look like a failure anymore. It looked like the blood of a battle I had finally won. "You had this the whole time," Joon-Seok said, turning back to me. He didn't sound accusatory, he sounded awestruck. "You were waiting." "I was waiting for someone who wouldn't use it against me," I replied. "John used information as a leash. I needed to know that if I gave this to you, it wouldn't become my new cage." Joon-Seok stepped into my space, his large hand coming up to cup the back of my neck, his thumb resting just beneath my ear. "I don't need leashes, Lee. I need a partner who sees the world for what it is. You didn't just give the feds a case. You gave me the final piece of the man who dared to touch what is mine." A notification chimed on the laptop. Mr. Cho looked up, a thin, predatory smile on his lips. "It's done, boss. The lead prosecutor just confirmed receipt. The Bektas are gone. John Durrock won't see the outside of a cell for 20 years. The tension that had held my shoulders rigid for 4 years finally broke. I leaned my forehead against Joon-Seok's chest, breathing in the scent of expensive tobacco and cedar. The dragon had provided the fire, but I had provided the steel. The sirens faded into the distance, taking the last remnants of John Durrock's legacy with them. In the quiet that followed, the grand imperial ballroom felt larger, the air finally clear of the toxic arrogance that had choked it an hour ago. The guests remained, but their whispers had changed. The gossip was no longer about a humiliated bride, but about the terrifying, elegant efficiency of the man who stood by her side. Joon-Seok didn't care about the crowd. He looked at me, his eyes softening as he took in the jagged red blemish on my chest. He signaled to the hotel manager, who had been hovering nearby with an expression of frantic apology. Within moments, a door at the side of the ballroom opened, and 3 seamstresses emerged, carrying a garment bag of heavy, shimmering silk. "I knew he would try something," Joon-Seok whispered, his voice a warm hum near my ear. "A man like that cannot stand to see a masterpiece he no longer owns. I had a second gown prepared. I didn't want your memory of this night to be written in wine." I was led back to the bridal suite, where the transition was swift and silent. The stained lace was stripped away, falling to the floor like a shed skin. In its place came a gown of architectural simplicity, liquid white silk that draped over my frame like a waterfall, devoid of lace or frills, relying instead on pure, unadulterated strength. When I stepped back into the ballroom, the silence was absolute. I wasn't the victim anymore. I wasn't the girl who had been splashed. I was a woman who had walked through fire and come out forged in gold. Joon-Seok met me at the edge of the dance floor. He reached out, his large hand taking mine with a reverence that felt like a vow in itself. The orchestra, sensing the shift in the room, began to play a slow, sweeping melody, a song that felt like the beginning of a storm. As we moved, the world around us blurred. The chandeliers became streaks of light, and the hundreds of elite guests became nothing more than shadows. It was just us. I felt the strength in his arms, the steady beat of a heart that belonged to a man the world feared, but who I now knew as my anchor. "Look at them, La," he said, his gaze sweeping the room before returning to mine. "They aren't looking at a scandal. They are looking at the new face of this city." I followed his gaze and realized he was right. The guests weren't pitying me. They were watching us with a mixture of awe and genuine terror. They saw a queen who had the courage to destroy her past and a king who had the power to protect her future. "John thought the red stain would ruin me," I said, my voice steady as we turned in the center of the floor. "He thought it would make me feel secondhand." Joon-Seok pulled me closer, his hand firm against the small of my back. "The stain wasn't a ruin, La. It was a baptism. It was the moment everyone saw that you cannot be broken by a glass of wine or a bitter man's ego. Some stains are the start of something beautiful because they show you exactly what needs to be washed away." We danced as the news of Duruk's arrest hit the morning headlines in real time on every guest's phone. We danced as the empire he had stolen from me was systematically absorbed into Joon-Seok's holdings. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was hiding in a shadow. I felt like I was the light. As the song reached its crescendo, Joon-Seok leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. The dragon tattoo on his neck was visible, a symbol of the dangerous world I had chosen, but I wasn't afraid. I was home. The perfect union wasn't just about the marriage of two people. It was the union of my resilience and his power, a partnership that would ensure no one ever dared to make me feel small again. The red wine on the marble floor was already being scrubbed away, but the legend of what happened that night would last forever. I was no longer the girl who ran from the CEO's shadow. I was the queen of the dragon, and our reign had just begun.